Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question comes to us from the True Stories collection, as in it actually happened in an event that I was actually judging. All these calls were from the SCG con that I judged last month in Cincinnati. As a judge, you never know whether you're going to get an easy call or a hard call, and the most interesting ones this time around spanned the full gamut in terms of how much rules knowledge that you would need to navigate them. Ready? Let's get started. First up, a classic. Amy uses Flashback to cast some sorcery from her graveyard. Nick plays Jeskai Revelation and targets Amy's sorcery as the spell or permanent that gets returned to its owner's hand. Into what zone is Amy's sorcery placed? Now, I would say Flashback is a very appropriate way to describe this ruling because this was a very important one to be familiar with several years ago in Modern, back before Remand and Snapcaster Mage both got power crept out of the format. The answer hasn't changed since those days, but seeing people ask about this ruling because they were encountering it for the first time did successfully make me feel old. If you, like me, remember a time when dinosaurs walked the plains and damage still used the stack, you might recall that the correct answer is that Amy's spell will be exiled, not returned to her hand. There's no way that you could reason this out from the text printed on the cards, so we'll have to look in the comprehensive rules for the official definition of Flashback. This is a good situation for me to put out a public service announcement that reminder text is not rules text. The italicized text in parentheses that explains what Flashback does is not meant to rigorously explain everything about how the card works. It's just a summary. And although reminder text on Magic cards usually comes pretty close to what the official wording would say, the templating team does make some compromises on this front in the name of brevity and readability. Another example of this is how recently the reminder text for the regenerate mechanic has changed. The newer text is much shorter and reads easier, but it's less accurate, including making it seem like the regeneration shield lasts indefinitely, using the colloquial term heal rather than the technically correct remove, and not explicitly stating that the regenerated permanent is not destroyed. So, yeah, bottom line, reminder text is a great tool as long as you're using it appropriately. The best practice in situations where you need to know exactly how a mechanic functions or interacts with some other mechanic is to look up the official text that keyword represents in the CR. So when we do that for the situation from the original problem statement, we can see that one of the things that Flashback means is that if the Flashback cost was paid, you have to exile the card anytime it would leave the stack. And as written, that includes leaving for any reason, not just because it resolved or got countered. Therefore, when Jeskai Revelation tries to return Amy's sorcery to her hand, the game will see that the replacement effect from Flashback applies to that event and exile the sorcery instead. The older example using Remand worked the exact same way, but it had an extra complication in that Remand did not directly return the spell to its owner's hand. Rather, it countered the spell and returned it via its own replacement effect. Now, if you'd like to see how that difference affected things, I talked about this interaction in my video on Rest in Peace plus Lapse of Certainty, which is another related interaction that you might find interesting if you liked this one. Next up, Amy wants to use Escape Tunnel to make Lumbering Worldwagon unblockable. She controls 2 other lands. Is this possible? Now, to answer this question, we'll need to review the steps for casting a spell, which are the same as the steps for activating an ability. Unfortunately for Amy, the step where you pay the costs is the very last step in the process, happening just before the ability is officially considered to be activated. Targets are chosen in an earlier step in the process, and this means that Amy cannot sacrifice Escape Tunnel before the game asks her what she's targeting with its ability. The Lumbering Worldwagon's power is thus too high, and the play is not possible. Okay, for this next question, Amy exiles a Superior Spider-Man with Ghost Vacuum. Later, she uses Ghost Vacuum's other ability to return Superior Spider-Man to the battlefield, having it enter as a copy of Grizzly Bears. What are the Superior Spider-Man's characteristics? Okay, so I think it should be pretty uncontroversial to say that it would have flying, because Ghost Vacuum puts a flying counter on it. And its name would be Superior Spider-Man, because that's what the copy effect says. The type line, and especially the power toughness, are somewhat more interesting. I think a natural reaction to this question would be to try and decide which continuous effect had an earlier timestamp, and use that information to determine which set of characteristics applies last. In contrast to a lot of continuous effects questions, determining the relative ordering for these timestamps in this situation is non-trivial. For Superior Spider-Man, its copy effect is a replacement effect, which results from a static ability that the Superior Spider-Man has. A continuous effect generated by a static ability has the same timestamp as the object that static ability is on, which in this case is the time when Superior Spider-Man entered the battlefield. In contrast, if you read Ghost Vacuum carefully, you can see that its ability first returns the affected cards to the battlefield with a flying counter, then it sets up a continuous effect that applies to those creatures. A continuous effect generated by a resolving spell or ability receives a timestamp at the time it's created. So is that before or after the Superior Spider-Man enters? Well, if you notice on Ghost Vacuum, the part where you return the creatures to the battlefield is written first, which generally means that it would happen first. On the other hand, we have this rule here that says if a resolving ability both puts a non-token permanent onto the battlefield and creates a continuous effect, stating the permanent is some characteristic, that continuous effect applies simultaneously with the permanent entering. Now, this makes it seem like the timestamps for both of those continuous effects would be the same. Now, that can't happen because the timestamps are meant to tell us which effect applies first, so there needs to be some kind of way to decide primacy. Now, this rule says that the continuous effect from Superior Spider-Man's own static ability receives an earlier timestamp than the Ghost Vacuum. One consequence of this rule is that if you use Ghost Vacuum to bring back a Timber Paladin, that creature will have a power toughness base of 1/1 no matter how many auras that you put on it, since its own power and toughness setting ability will always apply before Ghost Vacuum's. As a challenge question to test your understanding, you might consider what the power, toughness, and creature types of a duplicant would be if it were brought back with Ghost Vacuum and then it exiled a Grizzly Bears with its imprint ability. Interesting viewers can also check out my video on how Shoe If It works for some more context on this rule and what sort of interactions that it was designed to address. Now, it was really fun spending hours reading the CR to find those citations and coming up with good cards to illustrate this various points of this example. But there's just one problem. The timestamps are not relevant here because these continuous effects apply in different layers. Superior Spider-Man's name, type, and power toughness changing effects all happen in layer 1 as exceptions or modifications to the copy effect that sets its other characteristics. In contrast, Ghost Vacuum's PT and type changing happen in layers 7 and 4 as expected. This being the case, the Superior Spider-Man will end up as a 1/1 non-legendary creature-bear human spider hero spirit, which is the same result you would have gotten if you just went by timestamps, except now you know the correct reason. Also, another situation where this might come up is if you used a Ghost Vacuum to get back a Tarmogoyf. Although Tarmogoyf's PT setting ability applies in layer 7, the same as Ghost Vacuum's, timestamps are also not relevant here because the Tarmogoyf's ability is a characteristic defining ability, which always apply first within each layer. Therefore, the Tarmogoyf would be a 1/1 in this situation. Alright, one last question. Amy plays a non-creature spell while she controls Firdoch Core and Valley Floodcaller. After the spell resolves, she animates the Firdoch Core. What are its power and toughness? Well, the first important fact that we'll need to know is that continuous effects that result from a resolving spell or ability lock in the set of objects they affect at the time that they're created. This is in contrast to continuous effects from static abilities, which continually check and update this set. This and the difference in how timestamps are determined, as discussed in the previous scenario, are the principal differences between these types of continuous effects. This means that if we were talking about a Valley Quest Caller, Firdoch Core would definitely get the buff because this is a static ability, which means that the set of objects that are affected is not ever locked in. As soon as something becomes a rabbit, bat, bird, or mouse, it gets buffed. But hold on a moment. Firdoch Core has the Changeling ability, which means it's considered to have all creature types at all times, whether it's animated or not. And indeed, this is relevant. Only creatures have power and toughness, which means effects acting on a non-creature that modify these characteristics don't do anything. But those effects still exist, and if an effect would be created that would modify the power or toughness of a non-creature permanent, that permanent is still included in the set of objects that effect will apply to, even though the effect won't do anything to that permanent unless it becomes a creature later. Therefore, in the situation that we're considering, it does not matter whether the Firdoch Core is animated before or after the Valley Floodcaller ability resolves. The buff will apply either way. Be sure to read the cards involved carefully, though. A lot of older cards that did the same sort of thing specified their buffs only applied to creatures. If we were talking about this Rito Ringleader, for example, Firdoch Core would not be included in the set of objects that got buffed unless it was a human creature at the time the on-attack trigger resolved. Here's another complication that can come up. What would happen if you controlled a Mutavault when the Valley Floodcaller ability resolved, and only animated it later? Would the Mutavault be buffed? And the answer is no. This is because Firdoch Core is somewhat unusual. There's a rule that says only creatures and kindreds can have creature types, and as a result, almost every permanent that can turn into a creature only has creature types when it's animated. Firdoch Core has the Changeling ability, though, and thus it has all creature types all the time, which explains why it works differently. And to close out, I imagine some of you are wondering how Valley Floodcaller works with cards that match multiple of the creature types on its list. Valley Floodcaller's ability only sets up one continuous effect, not 4. Now, this effect applies to birds, frogs, otters, and rats. In other words, the set of objects that this continuous effect applies to is all permanents that have one of the types on that list, as this continuous effect is set up. If a creature has two of these types, that doesn't mean it gets to be in the set twice, it just means there are two reasons why it is in the set. Therefore, they'll still only get +1/+1. For the same reason, they would only get untapped once also. Now, this same reasoning holds true for cards like Valley Quest Caller. It only buffs each creature in the set of permanents it affects once. Contrast this with what you see on Aven Brigadier. It has two independent static abilities which create two discrete continuous effects. Accordingly, a creature that was both a bird and a soldier would be affected by both of them and get +2/+2. And that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.